So I'd like to introduce, if everybody's happy with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So Tom Campbell is a sports historian interested in the way that sport acts as a medium that highlights greater cultural, social and political issues. He's recently completed a master's at Durham, where he worked on the government and press response to football hooliganism in the 1980s, arguing that it was part of the Thatcher government's struggle with the industrial working class in Great Britain. His other research interests include boxing as a space for people from minorities to find agency, as well as the modern football stadium as a place of conflict and coalescence between tradition and neoliberalism. He's currently working as a maths teacher in London while completing an MA in education with Northumbria University. You must be exhausted. And his paper tonight is called The Dynamics of Race and Ethnicity in Egan's Boxiana. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. I'll just share my screen. So, yes. So I'm going to be talking about Regency England journalist Piers Egan and what his work, Boxiana, reveals about how boxing impacted on racial and ethnic power dynamics in Regency England. So turn of the 19th century England. Boxiana was tied up in these dynamics and is filled with descriptions of fights between British fighters as well as Irish, Jewish and Black boxers. Egan's descriptions of these boxers and their fights impact both discussion of this period and more generally the relationship between sport and ethnicity. The scholarship of this issue is dichotomous. Besnier, Brownwell and Carter argue that sport is a tool to structurally oppress marginalized groups, and Bodie argues that matches between Black, Jewish, and white boxers were used to demonstrate Black people from the period, white English superiority. On the other hand, Mason has argued that sport has allowed racially marginalized sportsmen a path to social mobility and a fairer playing field where knockout blows can't be fudged. Both views can't be easily squared with reality. There are many sportsmen and women who have been able to challenge racial stereotypes like John Barnes, Nicola Adams, Colin Kaepernick, and Muhammad Ali. However, it's evident that from the abuse directed against so many sportsmen for their race and ethnicity, that there's no such thing as a level playing field in sport. Egan's Boxiana demonstrates the way that sport simultaneously enforces and challenges racist attitudes. Particularly for Black men, boxing provided a rare path to recognition and respect in Regency England. And one scholar remarked that almost all the Black people from the period that are written about today were either abolitionists or pugilists. In this paper, I'll focus on the fights that Egan records between white, English, and Black and Jewish fighters, specifically Tom Cribb versus Tom Molineaux and Daniel Mendoza versus John Jackson. These fights demonstrate the nuance of the relationship between sport and ethnicity by showing that boxing could be used to assert white English superiority, but also complicated figure.
Hi, Tom. I don't know if it's just me, but we keep losing your sound.
Okay.
I think it's true for all of us.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sounds like we're picking you up now. So sorry. Do you want to just rewind?
I will rewind. Yeah. Sorry.
30
if
seconds
that happens,
or so.
it's just because it's peak time in London. That's what it is.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yes. So the scholarship is. I don't know quite how much you lost, but the scholarship is very much two sides of the same coin. Either we have a lot of people saying that sport is a path to not only social mobility but also a way of allowing people from marginalized backgrounds to sort of create their own identity and to represent their communities. But on the other side, we have the opinion that it's not that, it's a way of emphasizing ethnic and racial power dynamics. So Piers Egan was born in 1772 to a Protestant Irish roadmaker in London. He trained as a printer and developed a fierce patriotism and devotion to the monarchy. In 1824, he wrote, "I only request that I may have the opportunity of supporting the principles of my king and the honor of my country." He began publishing match reports of boxing matches anonymously in a magazine called Boxiana in 1811. Going public in 1818, he became a celebrity. Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine called him the most popular and successful sporting writer of the age. His works became the staples in homes of people from all social classes. These reports were the first of their kind, and Egan writes with a breathless immediacy that allows the reader to feel as if they're ringside. They read like a radio broadcast, giving blow-by-blow commentaries, and this led to Egan being known as Thucydides of the ring. Boxing at the time was hugely popular with the working, middle, and upper classes, and would draw crowds of tens of thousands. As its popularity waned in Victorian England, so did Egan's fame, and editions of his works have now become collector's editions. During the Regency, boxing was, as Reid argues, not only an English sport, but it was the English sport. George IV even had a group of boxers, including Bill Richmond, who I've put on the slide, act as ushers for his coronation. Bill Richmond I'll come back to, and is especially important because he was himself black. Conservative politician George Burrow said that as a championship match was considered a national affair, saying it was no vain boast to say that an Englishman was a match for two of the other race. Boxing was then wrapped up in racial power dynamics, and Egan's reports focused on matches where black and Jewish boxers challenged white Englishmen, which Dunning has argued were used to show Englishmen defeating black savages. The first fight that I'd like to consider was between English boxer Tom Cribb and Tom Molineaux, who was a black boxer from America who had won his freedom from slavery through boxing. Oh, I've gone too far there. And challenged Cribb in 1810 and 1811, but was narrowly defeated on both occasions. Egan sets up the contests by saying that the pugilistic honor of the country was at stake, the national laurels to be borne away by a foreigner. We see the narrative that the fight was an occasion to cement English superiority. Egan's account reflects the racist stereotypes at the time, using racist language to describe Molineaux, and reporting that he had a passion for fancy clothing, saying it was not surprising that the charms of the fairer sex should warmly foster the interests of the lusty Moor. Egan also says that Molineaux had to deal with a great deal of prejudice at the time on account of his race, and was kept safe by Cribb before the fight. The description of the first fight is exhilarating, and Egan tells us that it was much closer than the bookies had originally anticipated, lasting 34 rounds, until Molineaux gave up from exhaustion. One incident dominates proceedings when in the 19th round, Molineaux had Cribb in such a tight grip that Cribb could not shake free. But the 200 spectators charged into the ring and beat Molineaux, breaking one of his fingers. The referee actually allowed the match to continue, and despite this, Cribb's victory made him a national hero in the press, and Egan said that he was a brave conqueror defending the honor of his country. While Egan accepts that Molineaux was a great opponent, he said there was no question concerning the superiority of Cribb. Egan also records a popular racist song that describes the fight as a conflict between Britain and the other, and talks about British lads who would defend the country against foreigners. That Molineaux was American is relevant here, as the fights coincided with the increasing tensions between the USA and Britain preceding the War of 1812. Daniel the Jew Mendoza was one of the greatest boxers of the age, and had even managed to win the English championship. However, like Molineaux, Egan describes him as much maligned on account of his ethnicity, saying that he had a hard Jewish heart. Mendoza was renowned for introducing a greater focus on footwork into boxing, and Egan connected him with anti-Semitic stereotypes, calling him the cunning Jew. Mendoza was eventually defeated by gentleman John Jackson in 1795, which Egan regarded as restoring England's honor. However, as in the Molineaux fight, the playing field was anything but fair, and in the 5th round, Jackson illegally pulled Molineaux to the ground by his hair, but wasn't penalized. As with Molineaux, this was reported as an assertion of English superiority, and the Times described the fight as the Jew was overpowered by the Christian. However, Egan doesn't present unequivocally racist presentations of these boxers, who he regards as battling heroes. He describes Molineaux as an American hero, possessing almost Herculean strength, calling him manliness itself. His ability in the ring is lauded, with Egan describing him as performing wonders and praising his courageousness and his bravery. Molineaux's physical person was presented like an image of Christian masculinity. While eventually Molineaux was defeated by an Englishman, Egan also says that he was viewed by English boxers with jealousy, concern, and terror, showing how he challenged power dynamics of the time by removing them of their Christian bravery and honor. The article on Cribb is dominated by his bouts with Molineaux, showing how defeating him was seen as Cribb's greatest achievement. The significance of this match shows that Molineaux's success was a challenge to English superiority. Mendoza is presented with even greater veneration. He's the first boxer treated by Egan in his first volume, and describes him as a pioneer who irreversibly changed boxing with his speed and footwork. He opens his account by saying, "The name of Mendoza has been resounded from one kingdom to another." Egan describes his incredible skill in winning the English championship, calling him a conqueror after defeating the champion John Humphreys. When we consider how these matches were seen as a test of national character, Mendoza's taking of the English championship should be seen as a challenge to the power dynamics of the time. Egan goes on to say that Mendoza was one of the greatest teachers of boxing, making Mendoza the master of Christian English boxers who learned the English sport from a Jewish man. Egan also says that Mendoza was a figure of great pride for the Jewish community, saying that he was the acknowledged pride of his own particular persuasion, and who so far interested the Christian that in spite of his prejudices, he was compelled to exclaim, "Mendoza was a pugilist of no ordinary merit." This showed that Mendoza was challenging power dynamics and was a symbol of pride for his community, challenging the English perception of the Jewish people. A final example of this from Egan was the boxer Bill Richmond, who was the first famous black boxer in England. Egan says that Richmond was one of the most skilled pugilists in the country, and like Mendoza, was one of the great teachers of pugilism. Richmond was so successful that he started his own school for boxing, and was the patron of several famous black boxers, including Tom Molineaux. This shows the way that boxing allowed black men to rise in society and gain respect. We might think that an element of this may be due to Egan's own ethnicity as the son of Irish immigrants, but it is repeated in the visual culture of the time. Sporting prints were extremely popular, and while some do have racist imagery, many also show black and Jewish boxers as battling heroes, just as Egan did. The prevalence of these men's ethnicities in Egan also shows how boxing was a way for these men to represent and show the strength of their communities. This is reflected in Mendoza's own memoirs, where he writes that he felt himself as defending Jewish identity. The visual culture of the time supports this, and boxing gave Jewish and black men recognition in both popular and elite art, where they were portrayed as heroes. Black boxers are particularly conspicuous in sporting prints from the time, which were extremely popular, particularly in pubs. This print is a good example. It depicts a benefit for boxers held in the Fives Court at Trafalgar Square, which has now been knocked down. At the center of the piece stands a lone black boxer walking towards the ring. His position in the dead center draws the eye of the viewer to him. We see him with a powerful frame, his hand raised in a gesture of strength, and the print recalls an ordered classical painting with the light spilling in from the windows, reminiscent of David's tennis court oath. This, like Egan's description of Molineaux, shows how boxing challenged power dynamics by showing black boxers like classical heroes. We also see this in elite art, presenting black boxers as men to admire. Boxing was extremely popular with the elite, and Egan tells us that Molineaux had greatly impressed the fancy. His bout with Cribb was attended by Marquis of Queensberry, Sir Henry Smith, Lords Yarmouth and Pontefract, and several MPs. The best example of the presence of black boxers in elite culture is Lord Byron's Screen, which depicts Cribb and Molineaux's fight and depicts Molineaux as a formidable fighter. Egan's work then is important to the way that we view the relationship between sport and race. It shows the dichotomy between the view that sport allows for power dynamics to be reinforced or challenged is false. While most scholars have viewed Regency boxing as a way of demonstrating English supremacy, Egan's reports show that the reality was far more complex. While specific fights may have been used in narratives of white superiority, boxing allowed Black and Jewish fighters to assert their identity. This nuance is perhaps best described by Egan when he said that Molineaux only wanted an English heart to place him at the top of the tree. Molineaux may be being used to show English supremacy, but he's still described as a great man. Mendoza and Richmond are similarly admired by Egan, despite their ethnicity. This veneration of Black and Jewish men by a white patriot such as Egan shows how boxing challenged dynamics, and this is supported by the visual representations from the time. Boxing throws up many other examples where the ethnic identity of the boxer has become a focal point, such as Muhammad Ali, Tyson Fury, and many others. Recently, I've been researching the less well-known but no less powerful story of Johann Trollmann, who was a Sinto-Roma boxer who defeated the German Adolf Witt, winning the German light heavyweight title on the 9th of June 1933, during the Nazi rise to power. The Nazis tried to have Trollmann's title annulled, but the crowd rebelled and forced his title to be upheld. However, 6 days later, Trollmann was once again stripped of his title and forced to fight, with his ankles bound. In an act of rebellion, Trollmann bleached his hair blonde and covered his body in flour. Even in defeat, he used his platform to challenge and even mock the Nazi regime. This is a further example of the complex relationship between sport and ethnic power dynamics, with the match being used to both enforce and challenge them. Sport can be a path to social mobility for athletes from marginalized communities and creates icons who can empower those communities as well as affect change in the way that their communities are understood. At the same time, we should never consider sports a level playing field in terms of race and ethnicity, and except it often reflects or enforces racist attitudes. Egan's Boxiana is a superb example of this inconsistent relationship, showing Black and Jewish men who were simultaneously lauded as well as being used to enforce a narrative of white supremacy. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That was absolutely great. Thank you. Has anyone got a question? You can. There are so few of us. You could probably just unmute yourself if you do have a question and chip in. So, Sean, I think you've got a question.
Hi.
Hi, Sean.
I have a background there. It's not functioning very properly. Anyway, thank you for that, Tom. It was fascinating, really fascinating. Not a boxer I'm very familiar with, but I have come across some references to Egan's work in relation to the Irish boxer Dan Donnelly in that period. And I'd just be interested in your view in context of what you're discussing there, that issue of race and ethnicity and how Egan, the portrayal that he gave of Molineaux you described, but have you looked at his depiction of, say, Irishness through boxing in that period?
Yes, I have looked at a couple. I was aware of Jack, the prime Irish lad, Randall. I haven't heard of Daniel Donnelly. There is quite a lot of editions of Egan's work, most of which are very hard to get a hold of, so I haven't read all of Boxiana. His relationship with the Irish is interesting because he is a Protestant Irishman who has very much taken on the identity of a patriotic Englishman. In terms of the work on Jack Randall, that is something I have looked at in a longer paper, but not for the space of time we had now. He portrays him in a very positive way and doesn't talk about his ethnicity being a problem in the same way that he does for Molineaux and Mendoza. That's not to say that it wasn't. And it's an interesting point where Egan's ethnicity is what's really at discussion, right? It's harder to tell what he thinks about the Irish, it's not hard to tell what he thinks, but it's harder to tell what really was the case for Irish boxers in England, because of his own complex ethnicity. You're probably better versed in it than I am, to be honest, having not read about this individual.
No, thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating talk. I won't delay the speakers, but thank you for that perspective. It was really interesting.
Mike, did you have a question, or did you just accidentally turn your video on?
Oh, I did turn it down.
Because Tom's timekeeping was so fantastic. We've actually got time for a second question, so fire away.
I turned it off because I assumed we'd only have one. But no, I'd be, in a way, I just wanted to add a little bit more complexity into the feeling about Pierce Egan. I think you're absolutely right that one of the really fascinating things about Egan's writing, and particularly about the presentation of Daniel Mendoza and Tom Molineaux and everyone, is this sense that they're quite heroized. But I would add another possible dimension that I'd ask you about, which is that, in a sense, is it not important for Egan that he builds up Mendoza and Molineaux as significant boxers precisely because the British can beat them? Yeah, in a way, is that not a key part of that? So that there is that duality that you're rightly saying, that on the one hand it's respectful, but I think I'd also add, which you were certainly saying, that respect is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, absolutely. They are absolutely built up so that they can be beaten. What's interesting about the way that Egan writes is that while he does have a lot of, I won't sugarcoat it, he is very racist in the way that he writes sometimes. He's not describing the men as brutes or savages, especially when you depictions of black boxers.
Sorry, we seem to be losing you again, Tom.
Yeah, I think we've lost your sound again, Tom. Okay, I think what we'll do is can we come back to that question, Mike, at the end, maybe? Yeah.
No problem.
We're going to move on to Tanguy's paper now, and hopefully Tom will get his sound back, and then we can come back to that, like I said, later on. So I'll introduce our virtual round of applause for Tom. Thank you. So let's move on to our second speaker. Tanguy Philippe is a senior lecturer in education and cultural anthropology at the Superior School for Professorship and Education at the University of Nantes in the west of France. His research focuses on the construction of meaning and culture in sport and physical education. His PhD thesis, titled The Wrestling Roads, raises the issue of the acculturation of sport by exploring the cultural history of wrestling styles along the Silk Roads. So it involves research in Mongolia, Uzbekistan, Turkey, Armenia, and in the context of migration between the northwest of Europe and North America, so Brittany, Scotland, Ireland, England, Canada, and the USA. His current research aims to develop an interdisciplinary and comparative cross-cultural approach to the construction of body and sporting cultures in relation to education. And his title of his paper tonight is Jam or Bend the Knee, Crossing Views on How to Read Wrestling in The Wrestler and Sultan. Tanguy, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Tanguy Philippe, and I will start this presentation. Physical activities take part in the mix of culture. As elaborated, normed, transmitted, discussed practices, they crystallize larger elements of definition of a particular culture. They contribute to its diffusion and the cultural encounters by embodying the experience. Most, for example, defined how body techniques are learned to the point that walking, eating, washing may be performed differently and with different meaning from a context to another. Sports, and especially opposition or combat sports, enact one's relation to violence, harm, balance, and contribute ultimately to learning how to master and how to define what is legitimate and what is not. Thus, wrestling, which is our object today, is a game of balance and is often defined by some distinctive rules, establishing norms on what is valued by one group and what isn't. Some wrestling style, for example, include groundwork, while others may explicitly forbid it as vulgar. The symbolic dimension of sport is also ritual and narrative. Seminal works on games and sports, such as Huizinga, Kaiwa, Jeu, for example, underlines presence of wrestling as a rite of mercy associated to the vertical space with the action of throwing, pinning, or even symbolically burying the opponent, associated to the sacrifice of a horned male, a bull or a ram, and the harvest period. Different mythological and religious narratives associate the sport to liminal places between statuses and states, which are also territories. Gilgamesh, the city king, wrestles with Enkidu, coming from the wilds, at the gates of the city. And by doing so, he integrates nature and culture and then allows history to move on. Jacob wrestles an angel or God on his way from his uncle to his brother's lands. In the Bible, is named Israel at this occasion, Israel meaning the one who was strong with God. Sport is a means of describing a character of a person or a cause by an amalgam or immanent link between the action of the body and the moral of the story. We will discuss here different logics within the sport, its structure as a system of rules, and here precisely the relation between balance and space, its symbolic dimension associated to an approach of the context and how it is narrated, the reading we can make, articulating the different understanding of the sport and through sport. Different films use sport as main feature. Among them, some deal with the social reality and norms of sport and set the action within the wrestling world. Two recent films, The Wrestler, 2008 in the USA, and Sultan, 2016 in India, have depicted the attempts by former champion wrestlers to come back to fame and success. These films articulate different levels of signification. The story is paralleled to a myth with the help of the sport. The outdated status of professional wrestling and the antiquity of Indian kushti, this is a wrestling style, allows directors to limit the importance of time while the grounding of the narration, working class areas in New Jersey and mud wrestling pits in rural Haryana, strongly associate the fate of the characters to the sense of a place. The wrestlers' bodies are massive, worked or neglected, and that contributes to establish them as outstanding and uncommon characters. They are called by the names of their persona, the Ram or Sultan, that, alongside with their wrestling style, frontal for the Ram, imperial for the Sultan, present an immanent approach to wrestling and its on-stage achievements, opposed to real-life difficulties and outsider characters of the wrestlers. Aronofsky's The Wrestler is the story of Randy the Ram, a professional wrestler who had been famous in the 80s when wrestling was popular. 20 years later, the situation is unbalanced. He lives through his persona and maintains his ritualistic approach to wrestling, which is described as a work, even though the audience is scarce or composed of nostalgic fans. He still experiences acclamation that call for him to perform his signature move, the Ram Jam, and is seen as an almost divine miracle maker by a disabled man in the audience who offers his prosthetic leg to the wrestler so that he could cure by touching him. On the contrary, real life is a struggle and his world seem to no longer exist. He is denied a place to stay, a rented trailer of which he forgets to pay the rent. He is denied his chosen name. His boss do not want him to be any different than the other employees. He's even denied respect as he experiences poor interaction with customers. He manages to exit from this world by some words and some blood. He cuts himself with a ham cutter and brings back his persona to make a scene in the supermarket. In other words, he wants to define himself as one who doesn't step down, even if he loses a lot, so his job here. Physically, he can maintain some level of performance while experiencing exhaustion, coped with alcohol and pills, and heart attack after a violent and bloody match. He is told by doctors to quit wrestling or die. His personal life is presented as paradoxical and largely failed. He starts a romance with Cassidy, who worked as a stripper. Cassidy has a works, like the wrestler, as a work of body performance, but manages with her offstage life by building herself a future. She tries, if we can say like this, to domesticate the ram and to help him to become a father by recreating a link with his daughter and becoming a stepfather to her own son. The wrestler finally goes on with wrestling. He performs a final ram jam, a jump from a ring corner, and black screen, the film stops right here, leaving the spectator to interpret what happens next and listen to Bruce Springsteen's song, The Wrestler. This song, as well as the film, insists on the Christ-like dimension of the character, a story of renunciation and sacrifice until a form of apotheosis. Professional wrestling has been analyzed as a collective form of ritual, and some recurrent elements of staging are rather well known. In the film, the narration is altogether symbolical and grounded. It is grounded in New Jersey, in the 80s, in the working class, and in places associated to the body, strip clubs, gymnasiums, and hospitals. The film helps to understand the paradox of being strong, being visible, and maintaining a sense of a group or a place, even when it is disqualified. Sultan tackles with different stakes in the Indian society: the place of women, relations to Western culture, here the mixed martial arts. Sultan, performed by Salman Khan, is a former champion wrestler that a young businessman who aims to introduce MMA in India is keen to draft. The businessman would like to attract a large and wrestling enthusiast audience. The champion refuses, and the film goes back to the reason why he doesn't want to wrestle anymore. When he was younger, he started a romance with Arfa, that you can see on the left side of the film poster. She is a wrestler herself and daughter of a wrestling coach. He actually starts wrestling to seduce her. Their affiliation and character are symbolic in the story, as Arfa embodies strength and balance. She's a wrestler by heritage. And Sultan is a wrestler by fate. He enters wrestling to seduce Arfa. His unique character is identified by a rare blood group. They marry and Arfa becomes pregnant while they both know success in wrestling. She has to renounce to her Olympic selection, while Sultan's success and hubris led him to become selfish and arrogant. He refuses to withdraw from the international championship, which is planned at Arfa's due date. He is not able to be present, and their son, having the same rare blood group as his father, has fatal medical complications. The absent father would have been able to provide his son with blood and save him. For Arfa, her son's wrestling for life takes place while his father wrestles for some dreams. That leads Sultan to win little and lose everything. Sultan is convinced to wrestle again, MMA this time, in order to collect money to create a blood bank, which would have saved his son's life. On his way back to wrestling, he manages to come back to success, but faces one difficult fight. The mediation of his friends make Arfa know that only her support can make him win the fight. She eventually pardons him and helps him. She symbolically brings soil from the traditional wrestling pit to stand back and eventually win this difficult fight. They start again their wrestling career together. Soon she becomes pregnant again, now with a baby girl. The film illustrates the immanent link between physical and moral aspects associated to wrestling with relation of guilt and fate, humble character and achievements. One stable reference is the soil, which acts as a permanent regenerating symbol. Sultan's signature move is a back suplex, a technique requiring a strong grounding, a strong contact, and a fast hold taking. Both films address large audiences and extend the norm and stories of social subgroups of wrestlers to help the staging of a broader definition of the sense of the group and the place. It acts as a symbol which is, to quote French philosopher Gilbert Durand, a signifier, widow of the signified. If analysis can be performed, it always leaves space to alternative interpretation. We aim here to develop the reading in two main directions. First, ground and blood, and the sense of a place. Both movies propose an approach to the ground, the resting place, and to the blood. Presented as sacred, it is a place of familiarity where violence can be accepted and mastered. It is also a place of contact and grounding. The less difficult oppositions are distant and with little contact. More crucial clinches are tensed, long, with a firm hold or with an aerial character. The ram jam is altogether a headbutt and a leap. The back suplex is an aerial unbalancing with amplitude. The films portray the important moves and episodes in the stories in relation to the vertical space. Blood is present in both films and in different dimensions. It is always associated to life, with the difference of when it is shed, then associated to death and salvation, and when it is given, then a symbol of affiliation and life. These symbols are readable and may be associated to familiar narratives and mythological motifs. They are nevertheless used in context, and the association between ground, blood, and wrestling can be read as a reinforcement of transitions and negotiations between life and the threats associated to the story and the place where it always came back. Our main interpretation and reading is that this dynamic sport is a symbol of the difficult negotiation between life and place, whether it concerns one individual story or the collective mercy. Another permanent element of narration is a relation with striving, refusing to give up, maintaining efforts. One can win at wrestling but lose everything. One can retire and become resentful. One can lose but build a future. Wrestling appears as a pretext to stage a moral in the narration. This is most probably blurred by the seemingly individual character of the story, while the values, on the contrary, appear shared and well shared within the group. At first, wrestling is interactive by definition, and the symbolical association that we mentioned are commonplaces within the word of wrestling. Secondly, characters are always defined as wrestlers, the wrestler, or Pehalwan for India, and they are somehow wrestlers par excellence. They are hyper-typical wrestlers. Third, their action is located in a place which is also typical, and historical contextualization, which is not our main scope today, would show how much champions are indeed championing a cause or a group, typicalizing their difficulties and their attempts. Our reading is that wrestling allows to stage a multifarious and permanent tensions in a group, bringing to some dynamical elements of definition. wrestling can thus be read as an open and everlasting question of balance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tanguy, and thanks again for staying within the time constraints. Phil Dine has got a question for you, which he's posted on the chat, but I'll invite Phil to decloak and reveal himself and ask the question directly.
I'm in the dark there. I'm against the dark background. Salut Tanguy, comment vas-tu? Great.
Ça va très bien. Bonjour Phil.
Great to see you. Very, very much enjoyed the paper. Like many of us, I'm sure, I mean, one of my first contacts with wrestling, or, well, actually, I mean, I remember going to the wrestling as a child when it was a kind of popular cultural phenomenon back in my youth. But one of the first times of taking wrestling seriously was actually hormonal baths analysis. And I just wonder, your own semiotic approach doesn't seem too far removed from Barthes. I just wonder, what would Barthes have made of these two films? What do you think he would have thought of them? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and good to see you as well. Of course, Barthes is an inspiration in this analysis, and a lot of analysis, especially on professional wrestling, but also on a symbolical approach to wrestling, for example, which is in the Bible. You could see Delacroix's painting on Jacob and the angel, and Barthes analyzed also this wrestling episode. I think Barthes, in his The World of Wrestling, his seminal essay, articulated the myth in wrestling, which is excess and something quite intemporal, without that many historical references, and rather precise approach to the context. He describes the back rooms of French restaurants and cafes where some wrestling took place. For him, it was the typical wrestling, not the TV wrestling, but the backroom wrestling. And I think he would have, I don't know, probably developed the approach toward I don't know, maybe more the impact, the real impact on the audience, on the local audience, if I can make Roland Barthes speak. But I think his analysis and his semiotical analysis join precisely the image and its transmission. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah, I think so. Phil, did you want to add anything?
Oh, sorry, come back. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks very much. I think you're absolutely right, and I mean, it's one of these things as well. I must say, I thought that the Wrestler, I mean, I'm not familiar with the other film, I'm afraid, but I thought The Wrestler was a wonderful film. But it's one of these films I wonder whether I'm supposed to think that it was wonderful or not. You know, it's very powerful, deeply moving, and very paradoxical. Well, very ironic. I mean, given Mickey Rourke's own efforts in real life to be involved in boxing, that it's actually in wrestling, or in this representation of professional wrestling, that he leaves something which is kind of arguably more tangible and more valuable. So no, I very much enjoyed your paper, and I appreciate your answers. Thank you.
Thanks. John, did you have a question as well? Because I said we're running to schedule nicely, so time for a second question.
Sure. I mean, as I said in the chat, I was just wondering whether you'd thought a little bit about parallels to other, genres within, films about sports, specifically boxing, because there are so many that, it's probably an even bigger tradition, I think, in film history for the boxing film. And it seems that they're clearly comparable. I thought about, what Joyce Carol Oates says about boxing. It's not, you don't play boxing. You know, it's, in a sense, it's different, it's categorically different to many other sports. It's not something you play, and wrestling, I think, falls into that same category. It's so boxing films and maybe these wrestling films, they dwell on, you know, the suffering male body often, and it seems like the sport in the film serves a different purpose to sports in other film narratives, I think. I mean, have you thought about that, the parallels between these two types of martial arts in films?
Well, actually, my focus on wrestling did not start about films, and I came to reading through films more lately. But in a previous paper, I tried to create a parallel in the Irish context, especially, and then it was based on a form of reading of The Quiet Man. So John Wayne's portraying as well, almost like in Sultan, someone who doesn't want to fight anymore, and he was boxer at this time. And I don't want to spoil this movie, which is quite well known, but actually the parallel seems striking. And what I think interesting is that these characters, these wrestlers, these boxers, are not portrayed as ordinary person. And you would not want to be one of these person, because they do not seem to be quite happy with the status, which is a bit outside the society. And then that's an interesting note, which allows the story of the film to be built around this. And I think that builds a complex interplay between the body and its action, or its refusal to enter into action, and values, stories, moral, and a larger view of the group, actually. So these wrestlers and boxers in this example appear to me as a wonderful pretext and actors of the story. So that's for some elements of answer.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tanguy. Again, virtual round of applause, please, everybody. And we'll move on to our third speaker, Yann Descamps. Yann earned his PhD in American Studies from the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle Paris 3, and is now an assistant professor of sport history at the Université de Besançon. His PhD thesis dealt with representation of African American basketball players in the American media and popular culture, calling on various disciplines from cultural history to semiology and media studies. He's currently working on the representation of sports, race and gender in popular culture, from video games to comic books and manga. And his paper tonight is Be the Story. The story of basketball is narrated by the NBA 2K video game series. Yann, over to you. You're still muted, Yann.
Yes, Martin, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's it. Great. Got you now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Up to you.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much for inviting me, Martin, first of all. And thank you all for the great papers so far. It's great to be here and to listen to your wisdom and knowledge and thoughts. So as you can see, we are going to talk about video games here, and I shall get started since I'm quite talkative, but I think I'll stick to the 15-minute bar, so we'll be fine. So in 2015, the NBA 2K video game franchise teamed up with director Spike Lee to create a new My Career mode. In a trailer for the NBA 2K16 video game, Lee emphasized the importance of the story, saying, I quote, "On this court, the story is everything." He concludes his speech by asking, "What will your story be?" Indeed, among the media which feature sports, video games are the ones giving the most agency to its players, right? Yet, we should question this agency, especially when considering the power of narratives constructed or relayed by these video games. Indeed, over the past decade, the NBA 2K video game series has been telling the story of basketball in a signifying way, relaying several narratives constructed by the NBA itself and other media. And yet these narratives need to be assessed as they frame the history of the sport, anchor the archetype of the black baller in the players' imaginations, as it commodifies blackness and contributes to America's soft power. Thus, we can wonder, to which extent do the stories told through basketball video games convey political messages and contribute to constructing the global racial imagination? First, we'll point out the remediation of past narratives. Then we'll highlight the selling of the black baller story and the construct of signifying bodies, which raise issues of race, class, and gender. And last, we'll discuss the soft power dimension of the NBA 2K series and storytelling. This study called on various disciplines from cultural history to media studies, including semiology, to analyze the content of a selection of video games released between 2010 to 2017. And with an emphasis on these games, NBA 2K11, 2K12, 2K13, 2K16, and 2K18, because all these games were chosen for the interest of their portrayal of the game of basketball and its mediatization, as well as their representation of iconic spaces such as the playground, and as well as their portrayal of African-American athletes and characters. So we shall consider these games as discourse turned into images, as Mathieu Triclot wrote, and these discourses can be seen as terrain of struggle, as John Fiske wrote about the media discourse on race in America in the media. And following on the footsteps, in the footsteps of Susan Burrell and Mary G. McDonald, this study considers these video games as texts and offers readings of those texts and a critical analysis of the sporting narratives they relay. So first of all, these video games have made a conscientious effort of remediating past media narratives. First of all, from pre-game shows to post-game analysis, live statistics, the announcing of games, halftime shows, these video games try to reproduce the TV gaze, even though they also offer a new subjective view with the My Career mode, which is kind of revolutionary in this sense. These video games mainly reproduce the TV spectacle and give the players a greater sense of agency while they are engaging in this virtual, recreated, TV-like spectacle of their own performance. So basically, they start in the TV performance themselves. But beyond the TV gaze, video games also relay narratives which were built and told over and over and over again by other media, such as magazines and TV. From Jordan's heroics to the Bill Russell, Will Chamberlain, or Magic Bird rivalries, video games reproduce these media stories, thus turning these stories into common references and heritage for players all around the world. They recreate the stories told through other media, such as cinema, for example, and popular culture. The main example is the My Career mode of the 2K16 NBA game, which was written by Spike Lee himself as a clear reference to his 1998 movie, He Got Game. So while retelling these narratives, video games reinforce them and thus influence the construct of a collective memory, which is greatly influenced by the media. Also, the agency given to the players can represent a shift from remediation to transmedia storytelling, because as you can see, transmedia storytelling is about something that is kind of organic, that can be tweaked by the players themselves or by the public and as popular culture, as seen by Jenkins, for example. So it's really interesting. However, there is one striking element in this story, which is race, issues of race. Indeed, from the animatics to the trailers and My Career modes, these video games actually tell the story of a latently racist archetype, which is the black baller. First of all, the story is told through the video games feature an African-American basketball player from the inner cities whose parents, sister, and best friend are African-American and who works to succeed and be his own man, I quote, in a sports spectacle controlled by white figures. The coaches, agents, media, general managers, owners, team owners. Also, these games draw the emphasis on the African-American culture. So in a nutshell, race is definitely part of this story. Also, it is linked with issues of class. The main character comes from Harlem and uses basketball as a way to climb the social ladder out of the inner cities. That way, he leaves some kind of African-American dream constructed through other media, in which basketball and rap music stand as the only two options for the African-American youth. And success comes in the shape of an athletic scholarship, an NBA contract, and a shoe contract. Also, the playground crystallizes the links between basketball and the African-American inner city community and culture in America, with hip-hop music played through ghetto blasters or boomboxes and graffitis seen all around the courts. And last, these video games draw the emphasis on the black baller's constructed hypermasculinity or manliness. In the 2K16 version, the main character, Freak, and his friend Vic discuss their romantic feats and brag about their manliness through sport or rap. In the meantime, women are totally passive. Freak is the man in control whose girlfriend, called Yvette Ching Ming, is the archetype of the reified, hypersexualized mixed-race girlfriend. Women are mothers, sisters, girlfriends, media anchors, or cheerleaders. The only woman playing basketball, Freak's sister Cece, is actually described as a tomboy. So as you can see, it's quite stereotyped, right? Stereotypical. Moreover, the bodies are also signifying here, especially as they construct some fantasized version of African-American culture and the African-American bodies. First of all, the black masculine body is framed as overpowering and potentially threatening, an archetype of hypermasculinity. Also, the representation of all-star teams from different eras, from the 50s on to the 2010s, show the rise of African-American bodies in the history of the NBA, and they are politically signifying evolution, especially in their bodies, even in their bodies. For example, they move from afros to cornrows, and you can see through the hair. As you know, the hair is quite political in the history of the black bodies, and this is represented. Also, the playground is a place of representation of the black male's body, with an emphasis on muscles, tattoos, and haircuts. Clothes are signifying too. On the playground, players wear baggy jeans, do-rags, and other clothes related to hip-hop culture. And some of their moves are inspired by breakdancing, actually. In the neighborhood, it's called the neighborhood, players go to Foot Locker and wear famous sneakers, another important element of the basketball-related African-American inner city culture. Moreover, from Bill Cartwright's weird-looking free throws to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's skyhook or Kobe Bryant's fadeaway jump shots, video games turn past players and teams' games and moves into elements of basketball history. And most of these moves have been created by African-American players. Yet, from the court to the video game, these moves are sometimes deprived of their cultural and political dimension. Last, words and language matter too. Freak speaks Ebonics and talks trash. On the playground, players and MCs or masters of ceremonies talk trash also during games. And so video games, like if you can see these bodies, clothes, moves, words. Video games validate and essentialize the link between basketball and the African-American inner city culture and community. They commodify inner city blackness as bodies, clothes, moves, and words with some political dimension are turned into commodities. Last, also, the politics of these video games goes beyond representation of some fantasized inner city game and culture. First, they represent basketball's history, focusing entirely on America, of course. Also in the United States, basketball arenas could be described as museums. Also, indeed, when you go to these games in these arenas, you have the feeling that you're entering museums and see the history of the game, actually, which is a reconstructed history of the game. And they showcase and stage the history of the teams they host. And these museums are recreated in video games, making them media of basketball history, but a history centered on America solely. Also, these games celebrate the American dominance of sports. Athletically, the grades given to NBA franchises in comparison to European teams emphasize this idea, definitely. Most importantly, the status of the dream team, another big story, a very famous story. The status of the big team, of the dream team, as an untouchable myth, even on the virtual stage, reinforces this idea of an American superpower through basketball. NBA 2K13 is the greatest example and best illustration of this, as it promoted the very chance for players to finally see the 1992 Dream Team and the 2012 Dream Team face off, since no other team and no other country can actually face off against these teams. Anyways, also culturally, America dominates these games. Video games turn basketball into a spectacle of Americanness, from the anthems to the cheerleaders and the whole spectacle made of sports. Moreover, the fantasized African-American inner city culture is reinforced as a global reference shared by the players. Last, in the case of the NBA 2K16 French cover, as you can see on the screen, the cover puts the emphasis on the career of French player Tony Parker, right? Who was a young French male living the American dream. So basically it sets the American dream as the French dream also. That reinforces the status of America as the global promised land in terms of basketball, but also in financial, social, and cultural success in general. And last, we could wonder about the impact of these video games on the players' imaginations. Discussing issues of race and gender in hip-hop, Miles White wrote about the, I quote, American racial imagination. In the case of these video games, which are global artifacts, cultural artifacts, we could discuss the potential rise of a global racial imagination, one carrying latently racist stereotypes. The NBA 2K16 Ghetto to the NBA story and the NBA 2K18 Run the Neighborhood story contribute to framing young Black males from the inner cities as potential and potentially innate basketball players. They reinforce the stereotyped archetype of the Black baller and turn it into a global sign and myth, thus influencing the racial imagination of players all around the world by telling the same old story, at this time to the world. To conclude, video games are cultural artifacts produced for a global audience and shaping the collective consciousness of these audiences. As they frame basketball in the way it should be played according to their creators, meaning the American way. Then they frame basketball history, retelling stories once told by other media, when these stories already convey cultural and political messages. And last, they commodify and frame Black masculinity and African-American culture, mostly by relaying stereotypes. As cultural artifacts, they play a part in the cultural transfer of a signifying story around the game of basketball to a global audience, and their representation of the sport carries a strong latent political dimension, of course. And to assess this phenomenon, the French youth and its approach to basketball is a signifying case study. As David Sudre showed in his study of playground basketball in Paris, the French youth has been acculturated through the media representation of basketball. Some of the French players are deeply influenced by American culture and mostly by a biased representation of the African-American culture. This is reflected in the way they play and behave on the playgrounds of Paris, in their moves, in their bodies, the way they behave. The basketball video games, which have been released over the past 10 years, have contributed to this acculturation with all its political implications, leading us to question the true agency of the players facing such a powerful and problematic story, and its impact on the global racial imagination. In the globalized market of cultural artifacts, storytelling is more than ever a strong tool for both control and power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, and thanks again for staying within time, which means that we have time for a couple of questions. Does anybody want to, Jonathan, I hand over to you.
Okay, thanks for that paper, Jan. Some really fascinating insights on what goes on in a video game and what it represents. I mean, sorry if I'm... You're kind of saying that in some ways the video game you're discussing kind of contributes almost maybe to a myth of opportunity, that basketball is some way of accessing the American dream and so on. One thing that it made me think about is an article I read earlier this year by an African-American writer called Henry Louis Gates Jr. entitled "Why Are There So Many Black Athletes?" And one of the points he makes is, well, actually, there aren't really. And some of the stats that he came out with I found quite staggering. And I think he points out that there are more Black neurologists, more Black cardiologists in the US than there are Black players in the NBA. Given that sort of phenomenon, why is it that you think that the US seeks to portray this image of sport as an image of either the American melting pot or a field where there's more tolerance or equality of opportunity, when one could argue, look, you should be making this case about the field of medicine, given that there are more Black cardiologists or neurologists than Black basketball players in the US? Why aren't you encouraging African Americans to aspire to this sort of dream?
Oh, thank you for this question. Actually, it's the same old story, right? That's the main theme of these conferences and seminars. But when you take a look at the images and stories that are shared and conveyed through popular culture in America, there is a focus on Black entertainers being athletes or musicians and everything. And it is still the case today, even though in popular culture, sometimes in some instances, they try to deconstruct this representation or make fun of this representation or show how these representations are problematic. But still, there is a lack of other representations, and you're definitely right. And Henry Louis Gates Jr. Is definitely right. Actually, Irving Magic Johnson wrote in his autobiography in 1992. The last chapter of his autobiography is entitled "Message to Black Teenagers," and he says that America doesn't need more Black basketball players. We need lawyers. We need surgeons. We need Black lawyers, Black surgeons. He wrote about the statistics of that time, like you have 1% of all the athletes from high school going to college, and then to the pros 1%, etc. And he shows that the NBA is an elusive myth and dream for these players. But what you can see is that these video games, the NBA 2K video games, contribute to reinstate this myth and they anchor this myth as still something potentially achievable to the players to the video game players and to the players all around the world. So that's definitely problematic, and you're definitely right. But this story is still alive and well when you take a look at video games.
So is this basically about being kind of maybe a bit cynical about it? Is this about America trying to keep African Americans in their place and encouraging them to focus on, in some ways, modest ambitions, such as be a basketball player rather than be a brain surgeon, be a lawyer, be an academic, whatever?
Well, it's a very good question. And actually, when Obama was elected, there was a whole story around how he could represent a shift in the way we represent Black males, like giving another perspective, like they can be politicians, they can be presidents. So that was supposed to change the whole story. But what we can see is that through popular culture, most of the time, actually, this cynical story gets back in the game. And that's really problematic. However, my guess is that in popular culture in general, you have more and more representations that goes beyond this monolithic representation of African-American males. So that's for the hopeful part, right? But when you take a look at sports, and especially the NBA 2K series, it's all about commodifying one monolithic representation of the African-American community and the African-American male.
Thank you. Fascinating.
No, thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. I think Phil's got one, but Mike got in there first. So I'm going to go to Mike and then perhaps come back to Phil's question at the end after Jacqueline's paper and questions for Jacqueline. Okay, so Mike, over to you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to share this because I'm always inclined to ask lots of questions. But I mean, what I would say is fabulous, Jan, really, really interesting. And I'm so glad to see, that a lot of people are really critiquing and questioning this rather strange culture of video games, and what I would argue is the damage they do to the freedoms and the liberties of the politics of sport to be transformative. If you can contain it all and make it tell the same narrative every time, you actually neutralize it, you disempower sport's potential. But I wanted to sort of put the question the other way round, in a sense, which is, how can we resist this? How can we create something that is an alternative to this? I'm picturing in my head the fabulous video game of me standing on a basketball court and missing every single shot and saying that's something to celebrate, because we don't have to focus on these cliches all the time. But is there a kind of revolutionary intervention that goes beyond what you're doing, which is very, very valuable, to say, give us back the spontaneity, in a sense, give us back the opportunity to use sport as a greater form of resistance rather than compliance?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for this question. Actually, I have described all the negatives that we can see through these games, but also sometimes the players themselves keep some kind of agency. For example, recently, we've noticed that the players that were playing together, because you can play with players all around the world through these video games, you can come into contact with players from all around the world. These players actually came to contact, and they actually staged marches, political marches, during their video games, and they recorded them and they posted them online. You had also tributes to Kobe Bryant when he passed, so that's basketball related, but also there was some marches related to the more than a vote process in the US. Some athletes have created this association called More Than a Vote to show that players are more than players. They are citizens and they can vote, and this vote in this presidential election in the US is really brimming with politics when you take a look at the sporting fields, right, and courts. And so LeBron James and other athletes are really involved in this election. And actually, they actually went into the video games and posted videos that the video game players could see. They could interact, they could march, and everything. So there is this thing. There's also this tiny little agency. It's revolutionary, and it's really popular culture. For example, it's really the people that takes control of this media, the medium that is supposedly controlled by the story that is set for yourself. For example, when I talked about the race of the character in the My Career Mode, your player can be white, but he has black parents, black friends. He lives in Harlem. He speaks Ebonics, which is the African American language, and so. And you see how race is you're supposed to be framed, but you have ways to break these frames, and it's from the people, it comes from the players. And the last move would be self-representation. If you have, like, for example, I don't know, African-American video game creators that could create another game in which the players could have other horizons than only being athletes or rappers, that could be a solution as well.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jan. Again, virtual round of applause from everybody, I'm sure. We're going to move on to our final speaker tonight, Jacqueline Meloche. So I said that with I assumed a French accent there. I don't know whether that's right to do so. Jacqueline, do you want to unmute yourself as well? I'll do your introduction. So Jacqueline is an interdisciplinary art historian and artist engaged with feminist visual culture. She's earned reviews for her arts-based research in Canadian Art, National Gallery Magazine, Toronto Star, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. Her numerous curatorial projects include Alma, Carl Beam, Four Directions, Food, Feminism, and Kitchen Culture, Foreign Body, Corps Étranger, and Power Play, Hockey in Canadian Contemporary Art, amongst many others. Jacqueline is the editor of What Is Our Role? Artists in Academia and the Post-Knowledge Economy, and has published extensively. She is an adjunct assistant professor with the School of Creative Arts at the University of Windsor in Canada and part-time faculty art history at Wayne State University in Detroit. Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you, Martin, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to listen to everyone else's research. Thank you for the contributions that you're making. My paper, I'm going to be looking at art. The relationship between art and hockey, you might think, why? But early on, as I ventured into art history and curatorial practices, I came to know that many women artists in Canada are hockey players. And so that led me down a path. So I'm going to flip my screen here and take you on a visual journey with me as I made sense of it through art. So I will say that the original title, my paper today is based on my research for an exhibition that originally opened in 2019, February 2019, and that title was Power Play, Hockey in Canadian Contemporary Art. That exhibition is now going on tour and will be opening in 2 venues, both in 2021. And the title has shifted a little bit. And in my paper today, I'm again shifting the title to Power Play, Hockey and the Politics of Bodies on Ice. So I'm going to open with 2 quotes. Sport has always been a powerful medium for disseminating social meanings. By John Chi Kit Wong. The winter climate also afforded the opportunity to express a distinctly Canadian form of manliness through snowshoeing, curling, and ice hockey. So I will open with a disclaimer. I do not play hockey. And although I took figure skating lessons as a young child, I'm a terrible skater. But ice hockey, however, and I'll refer to it as hockey going forward, hockey appreciation, in my opinion, is not only rooted in one's ability for speed, stick handling, or athleticism on ice, and nor does it mean that one must buy into the paraphernalia of the game to show their support. In the context of sports capitalism, to be a hockey fan, as I understand it, is to embrace all of the ways in which the game is a metaphor for the economic, social, and political networks that inform identity politics in contemporary society, both inside and outside of Canada. Although a lot of my research right now is based in Canadian statistics and Canadian research. So in other words, hockey is a culture. And through an ethnographic lens, it translates into a methodology for deconstructing the entangled relationships between game theory, citizenship, and visual culture. So this image here that we're looking at is the title wall with a bit of an installation view of the exhibition itself that opened in 2019. So drawing from Canadian sociologist Jean Harvey's argument that hockey in itself is metaphorical, the artwork presented in this exhibition, Power Play, as well as the work discussed in my paper today, or some of the work discussed in the paper today, exemplifies the ways in which hockey symbolizes a narrative of omission in popular culture. To quote Harvey, hockey is more than a mythological construct. It is a legitimate expression of Canadian national history and identity. Hockey does speak to issues of gender, race, ethnicity, and region in this nation, albeit not in an entirely positive manner. For this reason, hockey moves beyond symbol and becomes a metaphoric representation of Canadian identity. The shift in my perspective on the sport occurred in 2002, during the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, when I witnessed for the first time women playing hockey on an international stage. They were Team Canada's women's hockey team. Throughout the tournament, they outplayed and defeated 7 other teams, including the USA, in a 3-1 finale, earning them the Olympic gold medal. While I was familiar with the game of ringette, the winter sport that was stereotypically labeled the female version of hockey in my local community growing up, I was not aware that women could be professional hockey players. But in February 2002, I watched for the first time Powerful, strong women such as Haley Wickenheiser, Danielle Goyette, and the team captain Cassie Campbell play hockey on a global stage, as well as embody an activism on the ice that continues to inform my appreciation and critical interpretations of the sport today. So yes, I've always been a hockey fan. I follow the Ottawa Senators. But as I started to embrace and understand the expanding narratives and the other bodies that play hockey and are associated with hockey, whether it be through business, sports analysis, broadcasting, so forth, realized that there was an expanding narrative here that was being omitted. And so moving forward as we go through the exhibition, I'm going to try to address those omissions in a material way, as well as a philosophical one. So in the context of health sciences, sociology, anthropology, and arguably political science, sports represent more than a game. Furthermore, sports are more than a platform for expressing nationalism and subsequently team or rather city pride. Likened to a vehicle for contemporary political debate, sports offer a space for dialogue. They activate conversations surrounding oppression, gender inequality, and social injustice. Lastly, they have the ability to transcend the boundaries between play and politics. In his research and writing on the game of hockey, sociologist Michael Robidoux argues that hockey offers a platform for critical debate, in particular debates surrounding patterns of inclusivity and exclusivity within the game. Quote, sport is regularly taken up as an important site for cultural contestation, often reproducing or resisting dominant Western values and ideologies, end quote. Inspired by the ways in which Robidoux parallels game theory and current affairs to instigate new narratives for body politics in contemporary society, my current research on sports and visual culture, both in writing and in curation, albeit in the form of art criticism and so forth, therefore asks two primary questions. One, how does hockey perpetuate models of exclusivity in North American popular culture? And two, what might an inclusive interpretation of the game look like? Historically, hockey is not an unfamiliar subject in Canadian art criticism, nor in exhibitions about Canadian contemporary art. In the last decade alone, 4 major hockey-themed exhibitions have been staged across the country. For example, in 2008, the exhibition Arena, The Art of Hockey, curated by Ray Cronin and organized by the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia on the Atlantic side of the country, proposed conversations between the game, its promotion of what Cronin, the curator, described as hero worship in mainstream media, and the essentialization of the gendered body in contemporary art. Other exhibitions include Hockey, which opened at the Canadian Museum of History in Quebec in 2017. Passion in Hockey was presented in Montreal and Quebec in 2017. And 2018, the exhibition Hockey, The Stories Behind Our Passion, opened at the Manitoba Museum in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And certainly, hockey has been linked stereotypically to Canadian identity, whether it be because of climate. Although it is not our national sport, lacrosse is the Canadian national sport, it certainly has been assumed to hold a specific place in relation to Canadian identity. In their own right, each of these exhibitions that have toured across the country negotiated new models for challenging the inherent gender and sexual stereotypes produced and disseminated in sports and popular culture. And while certain arguments and themes from these past exhibitions linger and are present in power play, my vision for the exhibition, as well as for the argument or thesis of the exhibition rather, offers a uniquely different interpretation, a different list of works, different language, and different perspectives on the game, as well as its impact on the body. Throughout the exhibition, or through 4 themes rather, so the exhibition itself comprises 4 major themes: hockey masks, hockey jerseys, hockey equipment, and hockey cards. And through these 4 themes, the works in the exhibition conceptually, materially, and politically deconstruct the patterns of exclusivity and inclusivity that media and popular culture continue to reinforce in the game. Whether embedded within conversations about commerce, gender, race, or religion, all of the artists in the exhibition are critical of the ways in which hockey represents otherness. Drawing from Edward Said's claim that cultural marginalization continues to perpetuate a society's false truth, my argument is that hockey's omission of other bodies thus has created and perversely disseminated the fictional identity of the athletic genius on ice. And I say athletic genius certainly to parallel this notion of the artist as genius myth that has since the 15th century been perpetuated by Western art historians, that then has favored artists of a certain class, of a certain gender, of a certain race, of a certain sexual orientation to then equate this definition of greatness. So I'm turning it onto the ice now and referring to the athletic genius as our site of inquiry, or the space of inquiry. So we're going to, for the sake of today's paper, I'm going to speak more specifically and in depth to hockey masks in 2 particular examples, and then I'll show a few examples from the other themes. But for the sake of time, we will focus on the mask. So the hockey mask, through a psychoanalytic reading of Masquerade, becomes a performative extension of the body and subsequently identity on ice. In Masquerade and Identities, Essays on Gender, Sexuality, and Marginality, Efrat Silon draws on feminist philosopher Judith Butler's theories of performativity to deconstruct the metaphorical function of masking in popular culture, writing that masking suggests, quote, all that constructs, represents, conceals, reveals, protests, highlights, transforms, defends, gives license to, empowers, suppresses, and liberates. In other words, that masking is the tool for deconstructing those categories of identity. In this sport, the hockey mask, although first and foremost a protective shield for the player's face, symbolically disguises a player's body on the ice. Underneath its fiberglass shell and hidden behind a facial cage, a player's identity becomes precarious and politically unidentifiable. Through a post-colonial lens, the hockey mask also embodies an assimilatory function, transforming all bodies, regardless of gender, race, and orientation, into one that is uniform. In fact, the primary system of body classification is a numbered one. By hiding all evidence of racial and ethnic ancestry, as well as disguising the Western stereotypes that signal a person's sexual orientation, the hockey mask therefore becomes a complicated device that de-identifies a hockey player's body in the game. In their facial interpretations of hockey, artists Kent Monkman, as we see here on the screen, and who we will see soon, Judy Anderson, offer provocative statements in the exhibition that challenge the gender and racial conventions that have historically contributed to the colonization of the body in hockey. In their appropriations of hockey masks, or rather the so-called face of hockey as a stand-in for an identity, both artists parallel post-colonial critiques of the body in Western popular culture by challenging the inherent imperialization of the body in hockey. So in this example here, in his series of patches, and it was a series of 150 rather, and this is edition number 69. For example, in his series of patches entitled Team Mischief Patch from 2016, Kent Monkman, a Toronto-based artist of Cree ancestry, channels his alter ego, Mischief Eagle Testicle, to challenge the colonial gaze perpetuated in the National Hockey League. Hereafter, I will refer to it as the NHL. By applying red lipstick or embroidering red lipstick and blue eyeshadow to the Chicago Blackhawks logo and mascot, a side profile of an Indigenous chief, Monkman is performing through drag the racial and homophobic histories that are still assuming the so-called reality of gender in the NHL. In her writing, Butler explains that drag, quote, drag is an example that is meant to establish that reality is not as fixed as we generally assume it to be, end quote. Moreover, the performance of drag plays upon the distinction between the anatomy of the performer and the gender that is being performed. Although, quote, if the anatomy of the performer is already distinct from the gender of the performer, and both those are distinct from the gender of the performance, then the performance suggests a dissonance not only between sex and performance, but sex and gender and performance, end quote. In the context of Monkman's patch, drag thus becomes a strategy through which to subvert the realities of gender and heterosexuality in the history of professional sports, in particular hockey. Throughout the last decade, the image of the Chicago Blackhawks team logo has become the subject of much political and public controversy. Both inappropriate and offensive in name and image, the team's capitalization on cultural diversity highlights the layered histories of racism in both professional sports and mainstream media. In the world of baseball, for example, the Cleveland Indians have also come under fire for perpetuating racism and indigenous stereotypes. In 2018, the franchise announced that their logo and mascot, named Chief Wahoo, would no longer appear on uniforms nor on stadium signage going forward. And although in the National Football League, the NFL, it is unknown if the Washington Redskins, for example, will ever change their name or brand. According to Robert Pitter's deconstruction of racism in sports, in racialization in hockey in Canada, from personal troubles to a Canadian challenge, Kent Monkman's team mischief patch too calls attention to the patterns of systemic racism and homophobia in a social institution in Canada that has arbitrarily classified people according to race and orientation. Quote, from the times of Saskamoose in the 1950s until the present, indeed, Aboriginal players depict a Canadian hockey subculture in which racist behaviors are endemic, ranging from routine use of the nickname chief to pointedly demeaning and hostile treatment, end quote. In a more literal interpretation of the hockey mask in this image, artist Judy Anderson deploys the mask, more specifically the goalie mask, as a symbolic surface on which to contemplate heritage and spirituality. In professional hockey, goalie masks are commonly used as a blank canvas for design and graffiti. In fact, since the first time that former NHL goalie Jacques Plante skated onto the ice in Madison Square Garden wearing a white protective shield over his face, the goal mask has transformed from being a safety device into a platform for political commentary. And while it was originally the surface on which goalies identified their stitches and scars from the game, today's goalie masks translate into metaphorical self-portraits of the bodies that the mask protects. In this example, her award-winning 3D installation entitled "This One Brings Me the Most Pride," Anderson, a Cree artist from Saskatchewan's Gordon First Nation, combines traditional beading techniques, graffiti, and spirituality to celebrate her ancestry and the people in her life, predominantly her son Riel, who played hockey professionally and was a goaltender. Made of moose hide and otter skin, the mask honors Riel, like I said, a skilled young hockey player, as well as the memory of the late political activist and leader Louis Riel, who fought for the freedom and preservation of Métis rights and culture in the 19th century. Embroidered onto the surface of the mask are the artist's interpretations of graffiti itself. Resembling words and images that have been scratched into a surface, this particular graffiti style in indigenous culture references traditional methods for sharing knowledge and communicating information. Although by entangling these material and social histories, Anderson's take on the goalie mask becomes twofold. Not only does the work parallel her interpretation that hockey is an institution that has perpetuated exclusivity, her goalie mask also becomes a metaphor for protest and anti-violence on the ice. So to conclude on this, in my paper, and in particular my research on the mask, I'm going to share with you a quote by Mary Louise Adams, a cultural studies and sociology scholar at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, whose research and writing aligns with my thesis of the exhibition, as well as the ways in which we as a society and culture are slowly starting to witness in relation to sports such as hockey. Canada looks quite different today than it did in the late 19th century, when hockey was originally promoted as our national sport. Yet despite tremendous social change, hockey remains central to popular notions of Canadianness. What this means simply is that those groups that were once served by the privileging of hockey, certain groups of white men, remain dominant in the country. Our so-called national symbols help to keep them that way by contributing to a national culture that reflects and promotes their interests and that continue to place their image at the center of a shared national identity, end quote. So like I said, there were 4 themes, 4 sections in the exhibition. The second section was the hockey jersey. And here's an example of the work that was in that section, another piece by Kent Monkman titled Nativity Scene. And it is I'd say roughly, I didn't include the dimensions, but roughly it hung on the wall, it was wall-based, and it was roughly 2 feet by maybe 3 feet, gold leafed covered. And it is a take on a critique of the Catholicism and religion in relation to representation. In this particular image, we have an Indigenous person wearing the Chicago Blackhawks jersey. We have the Hudson Bay Company, the quintessential blanket, if you will, that is underneath the child. And Kent Monkman, although as a painter, predominantly a painter, is very much invested in challenging the heteronormative stereotypes that have omitted the representation of the two-spirit Indigenous person, meaning a gay Indigenous person.
Jacqueline, can you
yes,
conclude now,
wrap
please?
up? Yes,
Yeah.
So hockey equipment was another one of the themes. So here's an example by Liz Pete, Saving Tom Thompson and Shutout Canoe. And this is a collage of all made of used hockey equipment. She is a hockey player and saves her equipment. Another example by Montreal-based artist François Morelli. And then the last theme was hockey cards. This is a piece by Quebec artist Marc-Antoine Faneuf, and it is a collage of hockey cards. And here's a detail, just to give you a sense, thousands of hockey cards. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Right. Does anybody have a question for Jacqueline? Mike,
if no one else is coming in, I'll support my fellow art historian. Welcome. And the importance of the role of sport within art. So I suppose one of my questions in a way is that one of the useful ways that your paper connects with Jan's is through this sense of uniformity and subversion. I mean, I really like Jan's answer in terms of saying there are ways that the uniformity can be turned upside down. And your focus on masks was fascinating to me from that perspective.
Thank you.
And in a sense, of course, what that's doing is it's creating the artifact, but it's turning the artifact into the object for display in a museum setting. I suppose, I mean, I know you started saying, you know, you're not neither a hockey player, but you are a fan. And I'm afraid I'm not terribly familiar with Canadian hockey past about. My only knowledge is from looking at William Notman's photographs from the late 19th century. So I'm a long way out here. But I wonder to what extent there might be levels of subversion through the mask or through the sport outfit in the practice of the game itself, because I've been very struck in the past that sometimes those subversions can be quite minor, but the way that a sport player will adapt a kit or a uniform, even in very minor ways, can signify very largely their level of protest or resistance, or, to get back to that word, subversion. So I wondered if there was a way that masks have done that sort of on, I was going to say on the field of play, on the rink of play rather, but that you're aware of.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So it's become very popular, at least I'm saying it specifically to the National Hockey League, the NHL. It's become the pattern, the hot trend for goalies to have their masks professionally painted, graffitied, and it really is the one space that allows any kind of identification or the revealing of any kind of subjectivity into the game. And certainly I can, in terms of basketball, for example, if anyone watched the restart this summer, that a lot of the basketball players were using their sneakers to protest Black Lives Matter and to voice their political agendas. And so I think we will start now, given the change within our social and civil rights movements that are certainly happening, I think, globally. I can only imagine that going forward, hockey players will start to utilize their equipment and subvert, as you say, their own messaging in different ways. Right now, it's predominantly been on the hockey mask. And that was because the history of the mask was used to, like I said, the first time a mask was worn was by Jacques Plante in Madison Square Garden. And that would have been in, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe it was in the 1950s. And up until then, goalies did not wear masks. And it became, once he was so badly, he was bleeding, he'd been hit and stitched up, that he put on a protective device in the middle of the game. But it became a space to showcase their bruises and stitches and to celebrate their heroicism, if you will, on the ice. So I think we're going to start to see a new kind of critique against that.
I mean, the mask seems such a perfect vehicle for it in a way, through the point about masking and masquerade and Butler. So fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. John has a question for Jacqueline. And then after that question, what I'm going to do is open it up as a free-for-all to everybody. So this one's for Jacqueline. After that, we're going to go around the houses.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline, for the interesting paper. I mean, I don't know an awful lot about hockey either, but I did read a few years ago an interesting book about Maurice Richard, the sort of, I think in Canada he's still a very famous name, right?
Still, yeah.
And it was Benoit Melançon's Cultural History of Maurice Richard, The Rocket, I think it was called.
The Rocket.
In which he demonstrated how Richard somehow transcended a regional identity, as a Quebec identity, to become a figure or an icon even for Canadian identity. And that was obviously in a previous era. And I was wondering, do you have an interest in star culture around the sport today? And is there anything like an equivalent figure in Canadian hockey today, or in Canadian sport even, that transcends that sort of regional identity, that might even unite the ethnic and other identities that you were addressing in your work?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yes, Maurice Richard played for the Montreal Habs, the Montreal Canadiens, who translate into the Habs, short for Habitant. So that was sort of their colloquial street name, the Habs. And he was known as the Rocket. And historically in the province of Quebec, there were two teams, the Quebec Nordiques and the Montreal Canadiens. The Nordiques have since become the Washington Capitals. So we have one team in Quebec. And Quebec is a very distinct province in this country. There's an ongoing desire for Quebec to separate. So there are political referendums that have historically happened. And so historically and politically, it's a complicated narrative, but certainly the fact that Maurice Richard broke those political boundaries, if you will, and also those geographical boundaries to become national, sort of to develop a national stardom, was very impactful. He remains still, he's still a favorite player for many. And in fact, in my slideshow, François Morelli's piece with the skates and the gate speak to him, the artist, as a youth, being a fan of Richard's work. To fast forward and think of it today, what's interesting right now is that, for example, if we think of PK Subban, who is now playing with the New Jersey Devils, but he did start off with the Montreal Canadiens, and he is one of a handful of Black African Canadian hockey players, and he has become a very powerful voice within the game. Within the exhibition itself, I collaborated or partnered with the Hockey Hall of Fame in Canada. And in my research with the Hockey Hall of Fame was introduced to Bev Beaver. And she was the first Indigenous woman permitted to play professional hockey in Canada in the 1960s. And so there are archival objects that I've inserted into the exhibition to introduce the ways in which otherness and other hockey players outside of the white male identity have created a fan base, but also have been instrumental in growing the game and the identity politics within the game. I'm going to say, in terms of any kind of, if we think of celebrity culture or the celebrity nature of hockey players, Wayne Gretzky will, I think, always remain number 99 for the Edmonton Oilers. And I think no matter what he does, where he does, he's a powerful voice for the game. But I think right now there's such a desire to look at the ways in which Indigenous players, Black hockey players are helping to grow the game more than anything in Canada. And that growth, as well as with women in the Canadian Hockey League. Haley Wickenheiser, for example, has done wonders for promoting and introducing the game to young women. So I'm excited to see where the growth of the sport might lead us to.
Okay, great, thanks. Jan had a question, I think. So I think I've had a couple of questions looking back through the history on chat. So Jan, fire away.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Jacqueline. I loved your paper and your presentation. And actually, it's not really a question, but I was so curious and frustrated at the end not to hear you talk about the other examples. Maybe you could just you could go through a couple of these examples to tell us quickly what you were supposed to say if you had more time to discuss. I loved it. So
absolutely. So like I said, so I broke down the exhibition into 4 themes because I had a lot of artwork. I traveled across the country and met with artists, and there were so many different interpretations of the game. And so the hockey cards, for example, Marc-Antoine Fanneuf, who's in Quebec City, was channeling Riopel. I can't think of his first, Jean-François. Oh my gosh, Riopel's artwork, who was a quintessential Canadian painter in the 1930s, 1940s Quebec, whose paintings were monumental. We're talking 20, 30 feet by 15 feet. And so instead of using brushstrokes, he used the hockey card. And the hockey card became this item, this keepsake of a hero. And so he was critiquing the heroicism that has been inserted into Western art history as one that still perpetuates the white male artist as genius. And so pairing that with the hockey card in this installation, it really, so hockey cards and the commerce side, the business side to showcasing and selling an image needed to happen in the exhibition. I also included cereal boxes that had hockey players on them that were borrowed from the Hockey Hall of Fame. Then in the hockey jersey, I'd mentioned Bev Beaver as the first Indigenous female permitted to play professionally. So I had loaned some of her original hockey jerseys, and they were inserted into the exhibition. There's a queer artist, Adrian Crossman, just outside of Toronto, who created a hockey jersey based on the notion in the history of lavender within queer theory. And so the hockey jersey as fashion, as another sort of platform for messaging, for protest, for advocacy. I had various artists who, including, I showed the example of Kent Monkman. So the hockey jersey as a fashion component made its way into the exhibition. And then the third one being, the largest one being hockey equipment. And the one piece that I didn't show, so yes, a lot of the artists have literally used hockey equipment from their own gym bag. I partnered, one of the artists, Hazel Meyer, she and I partnered with the Canadian AIDS Society. She partnered with the Canadian AIDS Society. I made, supported it 100, entirely. But what happened was, so the Canadian AIDS Society, Canada has an AIDS blanket, an AIDS quilt, just like the US does. I didn't know we had one. And not only do we have one, but it is preserved in 22 hockey bags that Molson Canada, a beer company, donated to Canadian AIDS Society. So we brought all of those 22 hockey bags, and we had a folding ceremony to learn how to fold the AIDS quilt. We learned about the history of the AIDS quilt. Predominantly, each patch were served as a burial place, because in history, if you died of AIDS-related illnesses, you were not permitted a funeral or burial service. So we were able to go into the history of AIDS activism in relation to hockey as well. So the hockey equipment, whether it be the bag, skates, goalie pads, as we saw in Liz Pede's work. So it was important to have these four themes so that I could dive into more detail and tell the stories that these artists were really looking into through the materiality of the game.
Okay, we've got time for one last question, if anybody has one. If not, then I will just use this as an opportunity for a bit of shameless self-promotion, or not self-promotion. Can you see my screen?
No.
No, okay, hang on. I'm working on it. Hang on, there it is. Sorry, I've got the right one now. Yeah, here we go. There we go. So this is a reminder about the next workshop, which is on the 16th of November. And is on sport, memory and identity, and involves three of the people who've been here tonight. So I know they'll definitely be there. But it will take place on Monday, the 16th of November at 6 p.m. British time. So I hope to see you all there. There's another event as well on the 8th of November, which is to do with cycling and writing about cycling. And I can't remember the name of it now, but it's called, it's called Write the Ride. And if you're interested in that at all, it's on Sunday evening and it's advertised on Eventbrite. So just Google it and you'll find it. Okay. Anyway, thank you, everybody. And thank you especially to our speakers tonight. Can we give them all another virtual round of applause? Thanks to Melanie, who's been feeding me questions and things all evening and managed everything technical. And who's just posted up right the ride as well, so you got the reminder there. This is being recorded, so the recording will be made available on the Institute for Modern Languages of Research webpage in due course, so you can go back and listen to yourselves again if you want to. But please feel free to share it with anybody who wasn't able to make it tonight. So thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and hopefully see you soon. Bye.